David Johnson had been dreaming about this moment for 15 years. Standing on his new 15-acre property, he could finally see his vision coming to life. The land stretched out before him like a blank canvas, ready to become the small farm he'd always wanted. At 42, David was tired of city life and ready for something different, something peaceful. The property sat on the edge of Willowbrook, a nice suburban neighborhood where most houses looked exactly the same. Perfect lawns matching mailboxes and driveways that never had a single weed. David's land was different, though. It was zoned for agriculture, which meant he could actually farm here. That's exactly what he planned to do. David had done his homework before buying this place. He'd checked all the permits, talked to the county office, and made sure everything was legal. The land had been sitting empty for years, and the previous owner was happy to sell to someone who actually wanted to use it properly. David's plan was simple: grow vegetables, maybe raise some chickens, and create a peaceful place where he could unwind from his demanding job. What David didn't know was that someone was already watching him from across the street. Patricia Collins had lived in Willowbrook for 12 years, and she took great pride in keeping their neighborhood up to standards. As the head of the Homeowners Association, she felt it was her personal responsibility to make sure everyone followed the rules. Patricia believed that property values depended on everyone doing their part to maintain the community's image. From her kitchen window, Patricia had a perfect view of the empty lot that David had just purchased. She'd actually been happy when it was empty. Empty land meant no problems, no noise, and no changes to worry about. But now, watching this stranger unload farming equipment from his truck, Patricia felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. Who does he think he is? Patricia muttered to herself, watching David set up what looked like a small greenhouse. This is a residential neighborhood, not some rural farming community. Patricia had very specific ideas about what belonged in Willowbrook. Nice cars and clean driveways, well-maintained gardens with the right kinds of flowers, quiet neighbors who kept to themselves and didn't disturb the peace. What she was seeing across the street didn't fit any of those categories. David, meanwhile, was completely focused on his work. He'd taken the whole weekend off to start setting up his new property. First, he wanted to test the soil and figure out the best spots for different crops. He'd brought his pH testing kit, some basic gardening tools, and a notebook where he planned to sketch out his garden layout. As he knelt down to collect soil samples, David noticed a woman standing at the edge of his property. She was probably in her 50s, with short blonde hair and arms crossed tightly across her chest. She was staring at him with an expression that definitely wasn't welcoming. "Excuse me," Patricia called out, her voice sharp and demanding. "Are you the new owner of this property?" David stood up, brushing dirt off his knees. He walked over with a friendly smile, hoping to make a good first impression with his new neighbor. "Yes, that's right. I'm David Johnson. Just moved in yesterday. You must live around here?" Patricia didn't return the smile. Instead, she looked him up and down like she was inspecting something she didn't like. "I'm Patricia Collins, president of the Willowbrook Homeowners Association. I need to talk to you about your plans for this land." "Sure," David said, still trying to stay friendly. "I'm planning to start a small farm. Nothing too big, just some vegetables and maybe a few chickens. It's all legal. The land is zoned for agriculture." Patricia's face got even more stern. "Mr. Johnson, I don't think you understand how things work around here. This may be zoned for agriculture, but it's also within our HOA boundaries. That means you need to follow our community standards." David felt his smile fade a little. He'd dealt with HOAs before, and they could be tricky, but he'd done his research on this one too. "I checked the HOA rules before I bought the property. Agricultural use is allowed as long as it meets county guidelines." "The rules may say that," Patricia said, "but you need to understand the spirit of what we're trying to maintain here. This is a family neighborhood. We have standards. We can't have just anyone doing whatever they want." There was something in the way she said "just anyone" that made David uncomfortable. He'd heard that tone before, and it never meant anything good. But he decided to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she was just protective of her neighborhood. "I understand wanting to maintain standards," David said carefully. "I'm not planning anything that would disturb anyone. Just some quiet farming. I actually think it might be nice for the community to have fresh vegetables available." Patricia laughed, but it wasn't a friendly laugh. "Mr. Johnson, I don't think you realize what kind of neighborhood this is. We have executives, doctors, lawyers living here, people who've worked hard to build something special. We can't have farming operations bringing down property values." Now David was starting to get annoyed. "With respect, Mrs. Collins, this is my property. I've followed all the legal requirements. I'm not planning anything loud or disruptive. I'm just going to grow some food." "We'll see about that," Patricia said, turning to walk away. "I'll be keeping a close eye on what you're doing here. And I'll be talking to the other board members about this situation." After she left, David stood there feeling confused and frustrated. He'd expected his neighbors might be curious about his plans, but he hadn't expected outright hostility. Especially not from someone who just met him 5 minutes ago. David tried to shake off the encounter and get back to work. He had a lot to do if he wanted to get his first crops planted before the season got too late. He spent the rest of the day testing soil, measuring plot areas, and planning where everything would go. But he couldn't stop thinking about Patricia's attitude. There had been something about the way she looked at him, the way she emphasized certain words that felt like more than just concern about property values. David had experienced enough discrimination in his life to recognize the signs, even when people tried to hide it behind other reasons. Still, David was determined not to let one unfriendly neighbor ruin his dream. He'd worked too hard and saved too long to let anyone chase him away from his own property. Whatever Patricia Collins had planned, David was ready to handle it legally and properly. As the sun started to set, David loaded his tools back into his truck and took one last look at his land. Tomorrow he'd start building raised beds for his vegetables. Next weekend he'd set up the chicken coop he'd already ordered. Step by step he was going to build the farm he'd always wanted. What David didn't see was Patricia Collins standing at her window, phone in hand, already making calls to other HOA board members. She was telling them about the situation that had developed and how they needed to act quickly to protect their community standards. The battle for David's farm was just beginning. 2 weeks after their first encounter, Patricia Collins had turned opposing David's farm into her full-time mission. She'd called an emergency HOA board meeting the very next day, presenting what she called a serious threat to our community values. The other board members, caught off guard by her intensity, agreed to let her handle the situation. Patricia's first move was to send David an official violation notice. She'd spent hours crafting it, making sure every word sounded as official and intimidating as possible. The letter claimed his farming activities violated multiple HOA covenants about maintaining residential character and preserving property aesthetics. When David found the letter in his mailbox, he read it twice before he could believe what he was seeing. According to Patricia, his vegetable garden was an unauthorized commercial enterprise. His plans for chickens would create excessive noise and odor problems. Even his compost bin was listed as an unsightly structure that detracts from neighborhood beauty. David shook his head as he folded the letter. Every single claim was either completely wrong or a huge exaggeration. His vegetable garden was clearly for personal use. The chickens he planned to get were a small flock that would be quieter than most people's dogs. And his compost bin was a neat, enclosed system, designed specifically to avoid any smell or mess. But David knew how these things worked. Patricia was hoping to scare him into giving up without a fight. She probably thought he didn't know his rights or wouldn't bother to defend them. She was wrong on both counts. David spent that evening reviewing every document related to his property purchase. He pulled out the county zoning maps, the HOA covenant documents, and all his permits. By the time he was done, he was absolutely certain he was in the right. Patricia was either confused about the rules or deliberately misrepresenting them. The next morning, David drafted a polite but firm response. He explained that his activities were fully compliant with both county zoning laws and HOA rules. He included copies of his permits and relevant sections of the legal documents. He offered to meet with the HOA board to discuss any specific concerns and work out any reasonable compromises. David thought his response would end the matter. Instead, it seemed to make Patricia even more determined. 3 days later, Patricia showed up at David's property with 2 other women from the neighborhood. David was working in his garden, planting tomato seedlings in neat rows. The soil was rich and dark, and the young plants looked healthy and promising. "Mr. Johnson," Patricia called out sharply, "we need to talk." David looked up from his planting. The 3 women were standing at the edge of his property line, arms crossed, looking like they'd come to deliver an ultimatum. He wiped his hands on his jeans and walked over to them. "Good morning, ladies. What can I help you with?" Patricia gestured toward his garden like it was something disgusting. "This has got to stop. We've had multiple complaints from neighbors about what you're doing here." "Complaints about what exactly?" David asked. "I'm just growing vegetables." One of the other women, who introduced herself as Beverly, pointed at his irrigation system. "Those pipes and hoses are an eyesore. They're not the kind of thing people expect to see in a nice neighborhood." David looked at the irrigation lines he'd carefully installed. They were professional-grade materials, neatly arranged and barely visible, unless you were looking for them. "They're temporary irrigation lines. They'll be covered by the plants as they grow." "That's not the point," Patricia said. "The point is that this whole operation is inappropriate for our community. People move to Willowbrook because it's a certain kind of place. What you're doing changes that." The third woman, who seemed uncomfortable with Patricia's tone, spoke up more quietly. "Maybe we could find some kind of compromise. Something that works for everyone?" Patricia shot her a sharp look. "There's no compromise here, Helen. Either this neighborhood maintains its standards or it doesn't." David was starting to lose his patience, but he kept his voice calm. "Ladies, I understand you have concerns, but I've followed all the rules. My farming is legal, it's neat, and it's not bothering anyone. If you have specific problems, I'm happy to discuss them, but I'm not going to stop doing something I have every right to do." Patricia's face turned red. "You have no right to come into our neighborhood and ruin what we've built here. We've worked hard to maintain property values and community standards. We're not going to let you destroy that." "I'm not destroying anything," David said firmly. "I'm improving my property in a legal way that doesn't harm anyone." "We'll see about that," Patricia snapped. "This isn't over." After the women left, David felt more frustrated than ever. It was becoming clear that Patricia wasn't really concerned about rules or property values. She just didn't want him farming here, period, and she was willing to make his life difficult until he gave up and moved away. Over the next week, Patricia escalated her campaign. She started driving by David's property multiple times a day, sometimes stopping to take pictures of whatever he was working on. She'd park her car at the edge of his driveway and stare at him while he worked, like she was trying to catch him doing something wrong. David tried to ignore her, but it was getting harder. When he was setting up his chicken coop, Patricia appeared with a measuring tape, claiming she needed to verify that his structures met setback requirements. When his compost bin was delivered, she demanded to see permits that didn't exist because none were required. The worst part was that Patricia had started involving other neighbors in her campaign. She'd go door to door, talking about how David's farming was going to bring rats, flies, and bad smells to the neighborhood. She told people their property values would drop and their peaceful community would be ruined. Most neighbors seemed uncomfortable with Patricia's intensity, but few were willing to openly oppose her. David would see them watching from their windows when Patricia came by, but nobody came over to talk to him directly or offer any support. The situation got even worse when Patricia started questioning David's right to be there at all. During one of her daily drive-bys, she got out of her car and demanded to see his deed and proof of purchase. When David politely refused, saying his property ownership was a matter of public record she could look up herself, Patricia accused him of being suspicious and uncooperative. "People around here don't act this way," she told him. "Honest people don't have problems showing their paperwork." David recognized what was happening. Patricia was trying to make him feel like an outsider, like someone who didn't belong and couldn't be trusted. She was hoping to make him so uncomfortable that he'd decide to sell and move somewhere else. But David had dealt with this kind of behavior before. He knew that backing down would just encourage Patricia to push harder. If he wanted to keep his farm, he was going to have to stand his ground and outlast her campaign of harassment. Still, the constant pressure was wearing on him. David had bought this property to create a peaceful retreat from his stressful job. Instead, he was dealing with daily confrontations and feeling like he was under surveillance in his own backyard. One evening, as David was watering his plants, he noticed Patricia parked across the street again, watching him through binoculars. Something about that image, a grown woman spying on her neighbor with binoculars, like some kind of detective, struck him as so ridiculous that he laughed, because he knew that Patricia's behavior was getting more extreme, not less, and he had a feeling things were going to get worse before they got better. Saturday morning started like any other day for David. He woke up early, made coffee, and headed outside to check on his plants. The vegetable garden was really coming along now. His tomatoes were getting bigger. The lettuce was ready for its first harvest, and the bean plants were starting to climb their supports. It felt good to see his hard work paying off. David had just started weeding around his pepper plants when he heard car doors slamming in his driveway. He looked up to see Patricia walking toward him with two other people he didn't recognize. One was a man in his 60s wearing an expensive-looking polo shirt. The other was a younger woman carrying a clipboard and looking like she wished she was anywhere else. "Mr. Johnson," Patricia called out in her most official voice. "We need to speak with you immediately." David stood up and brushed the dirt off his hands. "Good morning, Patricia. What's this about?" Patricia gestured to the man beside her. "This is Robert Chen, chairman of our HOA board. And this is Lisa Martinez from our property management company. We're here to deliver a final notice about your violations." Robert Chen stepped forward with a serious expression. David could tell the man was uncomfortable with the situation, but he was going along with Patricia anyway. "Mr. Johnson, we've received numerous complaints about your activities here. The board has voted to give you 30 days to bring your property into compliance with community standards." "Compliance with what standards exactly?" David asked. "I've reviewed the HOA documents thoroughly. Nothing I'm doing violates any written rules." Lisa Martinez looked down at her clipboard nervously. "Well, there are some concerns about the agricultural activities being incompatible with the residential character of the neighborhood." David had heard this same vague language before. "Can you point to a specific rule that I'm breaking? Because I've been very careful to follow all regulations." Patricia jumped in before anyone else could answer. "Mr. Johnson, you're creating a nuisance. Your farming operation is inappropriate for this area. We have families here who don't want to deal with the noise, smells, and property value impacts of your activities." "What noise?" David asked. "What smells? I don't have any animals yet, and vegetables don't make noise or smell bad." "That's not the point," Patricia said, her voice getting louder. "The point is that you're changing the character of our neighborhood without permission. You can't just move in here and do whatever you want." Robert Chen looked uncomfortable with Patricia's tone. "Perhaps we could discuss some modifications that would work for everyone." Patricia shot him a sharp look. "Robert, we've been over this. The board voted. Either he stops this farming operation or we take legal action." David felt his patience running out. "Legal action for what? Growing vegetables on my own property? You don't have a legal leg to stand on, and you know it." "We'll see about that," Patricia snapped. "Maybe you think you can intimidate us, but we're not going to back down." "I'm not trying to intimidate anyone," David said firmly. "I'm just trying to farm my own land in peace." Patricia's face was getting red again. "This has gone on long enough. You need to stop what you're doing right now, or we're going to take serious action." "What kind of action?" David asked. "Whatever it takes to protect our community," Patricia said ominously. After the three visitors left, David stood in his garden feeling angry and frustrated. Patricia was clearly escalating the situation, and now she had dragged other people into it. David could tell that Robert Chen and Lisa Martinez weren't really comfortable with Patricia's approach, but they were going along with it anyway. David spent the rest of the morning working in his garden trying to clear his head. He loved this work, the feeling of soil in his hands, watching plants grow, being connected to the natural cycle of planting and harvesting. It was exactly what he'd dreamed of when he bought this property, but Patricia was determined to ruin it for him. Around noon, David was setting up a new trellis for his cucumber plants when he noticed Patricia's car parked across the street again. She was sitting behind the wheel, watching him through those same binoculars. David tried to ignore her and keep working, but having someone spy on him while he gardened was really getting on his nerves. Then Patricia got out of her car and started walking toward his property again. David sighed and prepared himself for another confrontation. "Mr. Johnson," Patricia called out as she approached, "I hope you've been thinking about what we discussed this morning. I've been thinking that you need to find a better hobby than harassing your neighbors." David replied. Patricia's eyes flashed with anger. "Excuse me? I'm not harassing anyone. I'm protecting my community from someone who refuses to follow the rules." "What rules?" David asked again. "You keep talking about rules, but you can't point to any specific rule that I'm breaking." "The rule about maintaining residential character," Patricia said. "The rule about not creating nuisances." The rule about getting approval before making major changes to your property. None of those are actual rules, David said. Those are just vague phrases you're interpreting however you want. Patricia stepped closer, and David could see that she was really worked up. Listen to me very carefully, Mr. Johnson. This is a good neighborhood full of good people. We don't want your kind of operation here. We don't want the problems that come with it. And we're not going to let you destroy what we've built. There was something in the way she said "your kind" that made David's blood run cold. He'd heard that phrase before, and it never meant anything good. What exactly do you mean by "my kind of operation"? David asked quietly. Patricia seemed to realize she'd said something she shouldn't have. I mean farming operations, agricultural activities, things that don't belong in a residential area. But David could see in her eyes that wasn't what she'd meant at all. Patricia, David said calmly, I think you need to leave my property now. Fine, Patricia said. But this isn't over. If you won't listen to reason, we'll find other ways to handle this situation. After she left, David stood in his garden feeling shaken. Patricia's mask had slipped for just a moment, and he'd seen what was really underneath. This wasn't about farming or property values or community standards. This was about something much uglier. David went inside and sat at his kitchen table thinking about what to do next. He could probably fight Patricia's harassment through the HOA's own dispute resolution process. He could document her behavior and file complaints. He could even contact a lawyer if necessary, but David was tired of being reactive. Patricia was escalating the situation with every encounter, and he had a feeling she wasn't done yet. That afternoon, David was proven right. He was watering his plants when he heard sirens in the distance. At first, he didn't think much of it. Sirens weren't uncommon in any neighborhood. But the sound kept getting closer and closer. Then David saw the police cars turning onto his street. 3 of them, with lights flashing and sirens wailing. They were heading straight for his property. David's heart started pounding as the police cars pulled into his driveway. What could they possibly want? He hadn't done anything wrong. He'd been working in his garden all day, just like he did every Saturday. As the officers got out of their cars, David saw Patricia standing in her front yard with her phone still in her hand. She was watching the scene unfold with a satisfied expression on her face. That's when David realized what had happened. Patricia had called the police on him. She'd made some kind of false report to get them to come here. After weeks of harassment and threats, she'd finally escalated to involving law enforcement. David felt a mixture of anger and fear as the officers approached him. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but he also knew that situations like this could go bad very quickly if he wasn't careful. The lead officer, a Latino man who looked to be in his 40s, walked up to David with a serious expression. Sir, we received a call about a disturbance at this address. Are you the property owner? David nodded, trying to stay calm. Yes, I'm David Johnson. This is my property. What kind of disturbance? The officer looked around at David's neat garden and peaceful property. The caller reported suspicious activity and said she was afraid for her safety. She said there was a man here who was acting threatening and possibly involved in illegal activities. David felt his stomach drop. Patricia hadn't just called in a noise complaint or property dispute. She'd made it sound like he was dangerous, like he was some kind of criminal. Officer, David said carefully, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Officer Rodriguez looked around David's property with growing confusion. The 911 call had described a chaotic scene with a dangerous individual causing problems and making threats. What he was seeing was a neat vegetable garden, some farming equipment organized along one fence, and a man who seemed calm and cooperative. Sir, Officer Rodriguez said, the caller described you as agitated and threatening. She said you had dangerous tools and were destroying property. Can you help me understand what's going on here? David glanced over at Patricia, who was still standing in her yard watching everything. Officer, I've been working in my garden all morning. The only tools I have are normal gardening equipment. I haven't threatened anyone or destroyed anything. A second officer, a younger woman named Officer Thompson, was walking around the property taking notes. Sir, this all looks like normal gardening to me. What exactly were you doing when the call was made? I was setting up a trellis for my cucumber plants, David said, pointing to the wooden structure he'd been working on. Before that, I was weeding and watering. Nothing unusual, Officer Rodriguez frowned. The scene didn't match the emergency call at all. Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification and verify that you have a right to be here." David nodded and reached for his wallet. "Of course, officer. Let me get my license." As David pulled out his wallet, he hesitated for a moment. Inside, along with his driver's license, was his federal badge and credentials. For the past month, he'd been dealing with Patricia's harassment as just a regular citizen, trying to farm his land. But now she'd escalated to filing false police reports. That changed things. David had been working undercover assignments for most of his career, which meant keeping his law enforcement identity secret. But he wasn't undercover now. He was off duty on his own property, dealing with what was clearly a civil rights issue disguised as an HOA dispute. "Officer," David said quietly, "I'm going to show you my identification, but I need you to know that this situation is more complicated than it appears." Officer Rodriguez tensed slightly. "What do you mean by that, sir?" David slowly opened his wallet and pulled out both his driver's license and his federal credentials. "I'm Special Agent David Johnson with the FBI. I specialize in civil rights violations and domestic terrorism cases." Officer Rodriguez's eyes widened as he examined the credentials. The badge and ID were clearly authentic. This changed everything about the situation. "Agent Johnson," Officer Rodriguez said, his voice immediately more respectful, "can you tell me what's really going on here?" David looked over at Patricia, who was still watching from her yard. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could probably tell that the conversation wasn't going the way she'd expected. "Officer, I've been dealing with harassment from that woman for over a month," David said, keeping his voice low. "She's the HOA president, and she's been trying to stop me from farming my land. The harassment has been escalating, and now she's filing false police reports." Officer Thompson had come back from her property inspection. "Agent Johnson, everything here looks completely normal. There's no sign of any disturbance or illegal activity. Your garden is neat and well maintained." "That's because there hasn't been any disturbance," David said. "I've been documenting Mrs. Collins' harassment campaign. She's been taking photos of my property, making threats, and spreading false information about my activities to other neighbors." Officer Rodriguez looked over at Patricia, who was now talking animatedly on her phone. "Agent Johnson, what exactly did she tell the dispatcher?" David shook his head. "I don't know specifically, but based on what you told me when you arrived, she made it sound like I was dangerous and involved in criminal activity. None of that is true." "Sir," Officer Thompson said, "filing a false police report is a criminal offense. If that's what happened here, we need to address it." Officer Rodriguez nodded. "Agent Johnson, I'm going to need to speak with Mrs. Collins and get her statement. But first, can you show me any documentation of the harassment you mentioned?" David had been hoping he wouldn't need to use the evidence he'd been collecting, but Patricia had forced his hand. "Officer, I have photos, recordings, and copies of threatening letters. It's all documented." While David went inside to get his evidence file, Patricia finally worked up the courage to approach the officers. She walked over with her phone still in her hand, looking confused about why they were taking so long. "Officers," Patricia called out, "is everything under control here? I was very concerned about the situation." Officer Rodriguez turned to face her. "Ma'am, are you the person who called 911? "Yes, I'm Patricia Collins. I live right across the street. I've been watching this man all morning, and his behavior was very concerning." "Can you describe what you saw that concerned you?" Officer Thompson asked. Patricia gestured toward David's property. "He was acting aggressively, waving tools around, and he seemed very agitated. I was afraid he might be dangerous." Officer Rodriguez looked back at David's peaceful garden, then back at Patricia. "Ma'am, we've inspected the property thoroughly. We don't see any signs of aggressive behavior or dangerous activity. Can you be more specific about what you witnessed?" Patricia seemed flustered. "Well, he's been causing problems in our neighborhood for weeks. This whole farming operation is inappropriate and threatening to our community." "Ma'am," Officer Thompson said carefully, "farming on agricultural land isn't illegal or threatening. Did you actually see Mr. Johnson do something dangerous or illegal today?" Patricia's face was getting red. "He's been harassing our neighborhood with his activities. We've asked him repeatedly to stop, and he refuses to cooperate." David came back outside with a folder full of documents. "Officer Rodriguez, here's the documentation I mentioned." Officer Rodriguez opened the folder and started looking through photos, letters, and written records. His expression grew more serious as he reviewed the evidence. "Mrs. Collins," Officer Rodriguez said, "according to these documents, you've been sending threatening letters to Mr. Johnson, taking unauthorized photos of his property, and making repeated unwelcome visits to harass him about legal farming activities." Patricia looked shocked. "That's not harassment. I'm protecting my neighborhood from inappropriate activities." "Ma'am," Officer Thompson said, "Mr. Johnson's farming activities appear to be completely legal. His property is zoned for agriculture, and he has all the proper permits." David handed Officer Rodriguez a copy of his property deed and agricultural permits. "Everything I'm doing is documented and legal. Mrs. Collins has been trying to force me to stop through intimidation and false claims." Officer Rodriguez studied the documents, then looked back at Patricia. "Ma'am, based on what I'm seeing here, it appears you may have filed a false police report. The emergency call described dangerous and illegal activity, but there's no evidence of any such activity." Patricia's confident demeanor was crumbling. "I wasn't making a false report. I was genuinely concerned about suspicious behavior." "What specifically did you see that was suspicious?" Officer Thompson asked again. Patricia struggled to answer. He was working in his garden in a threatening way." "Ma'am," Officer Rodriguez said, "working in a garden isn't suspicious or threatening, and calling 911 to report normal gardening activities as an emergency is a misuse of emergency services." David watched as the reality of the situation finally hit Patricia. Her scheme to get him in trouble with the police had backfired completely. Not only had she failed to make him look bad, but now she was the one facing potential criminal charges. "Officers," David said, "I want to be clear that I'm not looking to cause trouble for Mrs. Collins, but her harassment campaign has been ongoing for over a month, and now she's escalated to filing false police reports. This behavior needs to stop." Officer Rodriguez nodded. "Agent Johnson, we're going to need Mrs. Collins to come with us to answer some questions about her 911 call. Filing a false report is a serious matter." Patricia's face went white. "Wait, you can't arrest me. I was just trying to protect my neighborhood." "Ma'am," Officer Thompson said, "you'll have a chance to explain your actions at the station, but right now we need you to come with us." As the officers led Patricia toward their patrol car, David stood in his garden watching the scene unfold. After weeks of harassment and threats, Patricia had finally gone too far. Her attempt to use the police against him had backfired in the worst possible way. The other neighbors who had been watching from their windows were starting to come outside, drawn by the commotion. David could see them talking among themselves, probably trying to figure out what had happened. As Patricia was placed in the back of the patrol car, she looked across at David with a mixture of shock and rage. She clearly couldn't believe that her plan had failed so completely. Officer Rodriguez walked back over to David before leaving. "Agent Johnson, we'll need you to come in and give a formal statement about the harassment campaign. But for now, you're free to continue with your normal activities." David nodded. "Thank you, officer. I appreciate how professionally you handled this situation." As the police cars drove away with Patricia inside, David looked around at his peaceful garden. The tomatoes were still growing, the lettuce was still ready for harvest, and the cucumber trellis was still waiting to be finished. For the first time in weeks, David felt like he could work in his garden without someone watching and waiting for him to make a mistake. Patricia's harassment campaign was finally over. The news of Patricia's arrest spread through Willowbrook faster than anyone expected. By Sunday morning, everyone in the neighborhood knew that their HOA president had been arrested for filing a false police report against the man with the garden. But what really shocked people was learning that David Johnson wasn't just a regular neighbor, he was an FBI agent. David spent Sunday morning working in his garden, just like always. But this time felt different. Instead of Patricia's car parked across the street watching him, neighbors were walking by and actually waving. Some even stopped to say hello and ask about his plants. The first person to actually come over and introduce herself was Helen Martinez, the woman who had seemed uncomfortable during Patricia's confrontational visits. She walked across the street with her husband and 2 young kids. "Mr. Johnson," Helen said nervously, "I wanted to apologize for what happened. I'm Helen Martinez. I live in the blue house on the corner." David wiped his hands on his jeans and smiled. "Please call me David, and there's no need to apologize. You weren't part of Patricia's behavior." Helen's husband stepped forward. I'm Carlos Martinez. I have to say, I never understood why Patricia was so upset about your garden. It looks great, and fresh vegetables sound wonderful. Their 8-year-old daughter was staring wide-eyed at David's tomato plants. Are those really going to turn into tomatoes? She asked. David knelt down to her level. They sure are. Want to see how big they're getting? For the next few minutes, David gave the Martinez family a tour of his garden. He showed them the different vegetables he was growing, explained how the irrigation system worked, and talked about his plans for adding chickens in the fall. The kids were fascinated, asking dozens of questions about how plants grow and when the vegetables would be ready to eat. You know, Carlos said, my kids have never seen vegetables actually growing. This is really educational for them. You're welcome to bring them by any time, David said. I'd be happy to show them how everything works. As word spread about David's real job, people started to understand why Patricia's behavior had been so problematic. Robert Chen, the HOA board chairman, came by Monday evening to talk to David personally. Agent Johnson, Robert said, looking embarrassed. I owe you a huge apology. Patricia convinced the board that you were violating community standards, but now I realize she was manipulating the situation. David invited Robert to sit on his porch, and they talked for over an hour. Robert explained that Patricia had been pushing the board to take action for weeks, claiming that David's farming would ruin the neighborhood. She'd shown them selective photos that made his neat garden look messy and disorganized. She kept saying we had to act quickly before things got out of hand, Robert said. She made it sound like you were being uncooperative and refusing to follow reasonable requests. Did she ever mention that I had provided documentation showing all my activities were legal? David asked. Robert shook his head. No, she told us you wouldn't provide any paperwork, and were being secretive about your plans. David pulled out copies of all the letters and documents he'd sent to the HOA. Robert read through them with growing anger, realizing how completely Patricia had misrepresented the situation. This is fraud, Robert said. She lied to the entire board about what was happening. I'm calling an emergency meeting tomorrow night to remove her from office and formally apologize. The emergency HOA meeting was packed with neighbors who wanted to understand what had really happened. Robert Chen presented all the evidence of Patricia's deception, including the false claims she'd made to the board and the harassment campaign she'd conducted against David Lisa Martinez from the property management company. Explained that David's activities were completely legal and that the HOA had no authority to stop them. She also revealed that Patricia had been pressuring her to find legal ways to force David to stop farming. Even though no such legal authority existed, the board voted unanimously to remove Patricia as president and to issue a formal apology to David. They also voted to change HOA policies to prevent future harassment of residents who were following all applicable laws. Beverly Thompson, one of the women who had originally accompanied Patricia on her confrontational visits, stood up during the public comment period.